Your spiritual journey is wrapped up in your family's history, which is wrapped up in the nation's history or global history, depending on your family. And all of that is deeply connected to your present. Hello and welcome back. I'm Peyton, and we are still talking identity, spirituality, and reality through the lens of Gloria Anzaldúa's work. We're specifically looking at the book Light in the Dark. You don't have to be familiar with her at all or any of these texts. I'm reading them essentially for us. So yeah, if you're into thinking about existential shit, this might be for you. We're on chapter 3 right now, which is called Border Arte, and it is all about art that is coming out of the Borderlands, but also borderland thinkers. So of course, Anzaldúa, from a Chicana background, she's writing from about the Mexican-American border, the U.S.-Mexico border. However, towards the end of the chapter, she says that this also applies to a wide variety of borders. There are far more people, writing about borders and borderlands and occupying what she calls Nepantla, which, of course, prior in the book, she talks about Nepantla as that space in between. It's that transitional space in between cultures and realities and consciousness. But in this specific chapter, she's talking about Chicana art. And this whole chapter is structured around her experience going to the Denver Museum of Natural History's new Aztec exhibition that they were opening. And she kind of sets the scene as how complicated it is to show up, as a Chicana. Like she says, as a people who have been stripped of our history, language, identity, and pride, we attempt again and again to find what we have lost by digging into our cultural roots, imaginatively, and making art from our findings. I ask myself, what does it mean for me, esta jutita, this queer Chicana, to enter a museum and look at indigenous objects that were once used by my ancestors? Will I find my historical Indian identity here at this museum among the ancient artifacts and their mestizaje? I, too, am passively consuming and appropriating an indigenous culture. I walked in with a group of Chicano kids, and now we are being taught secondhand our cultural roots twice removed by whites. The essence of colonization: rip off a culture, then regurgitate its white version to the natives. And I would argue sell it. So that is how she's setting up this chapter, both acknowledging the sort of Chicana tradition to almost appropriate certain histories and images and indigenous roots. I'm using the word appropriates very intentionally because that is what she is talking about in this chapter. She acknowledges that it is still appropriation, but it is appropriation for a different purpose than, for example, for commercialization. But Anzaldúa calls the museum itself as a colonized structure. It enacts a psychosis of sorts, implying that all Aztecs are dead and only inhabit prehistory. It induces a double beingness in me, feeling my Mexican indigenous aspects represented, while at the same time feeling those parts of myself disappeared. And I will say it's not quite the same, but I have a story that I think relates to this idea of that double beingness. Because my grandpa a few years back did an Ancestry.com, test or whatever. And it came back that he was half Spaniard and half indigenous Mexican. And it's been really interesting to see what he's done with that information, because this is a man who is incredibly knowledgeable about history, but has really only read history from the colonizer's perspective, which makes for a complicated identity to begin with. But it was interesting because he ended up going to some Native American museum or something, or there was some exhibition for Native American culture that he went to, specifically as a tourist, I should add. And he ended up bringing me back something from the gift shop. And when he was presenting me this gift, he really did take it seriously. I could tell that he was really honored to be gifting me this piece of what is also my heritage, because I think that was around the time that I was doing a lot of cultural roots work and digging and art. And so that was part of the inspiration, but it was interesting because it was from a gift shop. right? And so it was like this silver like necklace with some turquoise in the shape of like a bear claw. And he, wanted me to wear it. And then anyone that ever commented on it, he wanted me to tell them that I'm Native American. And of course, that's complicated, but it was such an interesting, like, I could feel that this felt like for him, he was finding a connection to his ancestry through this gift shop. And like, I don't know, it was almost like they sold him the idea of being able to pass on culture that is like very much dead and gone, at least in my family. Like my family has been pretty colonized, at least in the like psychic capacity. But when she talks about the double beingness where she's walking around and she's feeling parts of herself, like knowing that connection exists, that ancestral like connection, and also feeling totally removed from it simultaneously, right? Like both of which are informing each other. It's a very complicated perspective that she's talking about. And again, my story doesn't like, it's not the same as her situation, but it that doubleness definitely, I think, resonates there. She says, though I too am a gaping consumer, I feel that these artworks are part of my legacy. My appropriation differs from the misappropriation by outsiders, because she ends up talking about how specifically in like Chicana and Tejana art, the three madres, she says Guadalupe, La Malinche, and La Llorona, are cultural figures that Chicana writers and artists constantly reread in their works. It is very much like of a tradition of sorts. And so she's talking about how that kind of appropriation is not at all the same kind as what she says when mainstream culture uses them, because she says that these figures have arrived at market, but they aren't sellouts, the figures themselves, even though they have arrived at market. And she uses the milk industry's Got Milk commercial featuring La Llorona as the example. So she's saying that that is not the same kind of appropriation as Chicano and Latino appropriation of rereading and rewriting their own histories. So she says appropriating these figures is part of the cultural recovery and recuperation work Chicana artists and writers have been doing for the past couple of decades, finally acknowledging and accepting our native origins, which we denied 15 years ago. So again, there's like this collective awakening amongst the Chicana community of indigenous roots. And she says, only now we've gone to the other extreme, becoming, claiming, and acting as though we're more indigenous than Native Americans themselves, something that Native Americans rightfully resent and thus the source of recent Chicana Native conflict. Being assimilated into white culture, being part indigenous, being artists yet having to survive in the real world puts us in a precarious position with our feet in different worlds. So she's saying again, like being assimilated into white culture and being part indigenous, that is feet in both worlds. Being an artist yet having to survive in the real world, that is also a foot in both worlds. And she's saying that that's where the precarity comes from. She says, the Chicanas are aware that we aren't Indian and don't live in a Native American culture. And though our roots are indigenous, we often do misappropriate and collude with the Anglo's form of misappropriation. So this is a call out, or maybe a call in. So she's saying that some of the appropriation is that recuperation work, but then when you swing a little too far and you start to get a little too righteous about it, that's the place that she's starting to critique here. So she keeps on walking through this museum, and it's interesting because she's sort of walking us through it, and then something that she sees or something that she writes about will spark sort of a different tangent, and then ultimately she'll return us back to like where she is in the museum. So that's again a constant theme throughout, but she ends up talking about metaphors as gods. She says metaphors are gods. According to archetypal psychology, we have internalized the old deities, animals, and forces of nature that our ancestors considered gods. We could say that the metaphors are allies, spirits, transformative aspects of the unconscious seeking to enter consciousness. In my case, snake is one of my allies or guardian animals. The new culture adopts, modifies, and enriches these images and, in turn, passes them on changed. In the case of Native American spiritual practices such as the vision quest, the practices, rituals, and ceremonies have been disrespectfully appropriated and misappropriated by whites, Chicanos, and Latinos. Some Native Americans call these thieves white shamans or plastic medicine men. And then she speaks about a Lakota writer who accuses non-natives of pirating misunderstood pieces of indigenous shamanism to feed the white man's fantasies, forcing the Indians to deal with American fantasies about the Indians of white imagination rather than the reality of the present. So one of her grievances about this museum was that she says that it sort of implies that all Aztecs are dead and have been for hundreds of years, when in reality there are 10,000 Aztec survivors living in Mexico now, as she's writing it. So she's talking about that like psychosis that it enacts, where reality is denied for some fictional fantasy of the indigenous peoples, right? And this is part of what she's returning to, saying that it's not just like the white fantasy, but it has also been that mindset imposed onto indigenous practices by Chicanos and Latinos. And then she says the artist on some level still connects to an unconscious reservoir of meaning, connects to a Nepantla state of transition between time periods, connects to the border between cultures. And again, she returns to Nepantla because this is what happens when we have this like constant friction of cultures rubbing up on each other, right? We have this tension. But she says this place in between places, Nepantla, is where at once we are detached or separated and attached or connected to each of our several cultures. Here, the watcher on the bridge, or Nepantla, can see through the larger symbolic process that's trying to become conscious through a particular life situation or event. Nepantla is the midway point between the conscious and the unconscious, the place where transformations are enacted. Nepantla is a place where we can accept contradiction and paradox. And of course, that's how she connects it to the Borderlands. She compares the Borderlands to Jorge Luis Borges' Aleph, which is a short story. Aleph is a place in this story where you can see everything all at once without any hierarchy. So you get to see every memory, every object, every perspective, like they're all coexisting at once outside of any ranking of importance. And she talks about how someone in the Borderlands experiences contradictions all at once, all of the time, right? So the histories of both the colonizer and the colonized, right? Both of those narratives, multiple languages, various understandings of gender and sexuality. She says the Borderlands are like el árbol de la vida, which crosses all dimensions, the sky, spiritual space, the earth, and the underworld. That's the tree of life. She also said it's also like el cenote, the Mayan well, an umbilical cord connecting us to the earth and to concrete reality. All people in Nepantla, natives, immigrants, colored, white, queers, heterosexuals, from this side of the border, del otro lado, are personas de lugar, local people, and relate to the border and to the Nepantla states in different ways. So I want to clarify, the way that she's talking about Borderlands is like the physical manifestation of Nepantla, which is more of like can be anywhere, right? Which brings forth the specific histories and conditions of the US-Mexico border, since that's what she's talking about here, but also zooming out to, I don't want to say not look at those like details, but just look at the more broad patterns happening. That's why she says that Nepantla can be thought about no matter where you are. So as she's walking through this museum, she keeps on thinking about all of the nuance here in terms of art and appropriation and recreation and the conditions of creation. And I'm going to read a quote here. She says, "The present unparalleled economic depression in the arts, gutted by government funding cutbacks, threatens los artistas de la frontera, the artists of the border. Sponsoring corporations that judge projects by family values criteria force multicultural artists to hang tough and brave out financial and professional instability. I walk into the Aztec Museum gift shop, where we are sold and see feathers, paper flowers, and ceramic statues of fertility goddesses priced at 10 times what they sell for in Mexico. Border art is becoming trendy in these neocolonial times of art tourism and pop culture ripoffs. Of course, colonizing, commercializing, and consuming the art of ethnic people and of queer writers and artists is nothing new. However, our art is now being misappropriated by pop culture. Diversity is sold on TV, on billboards, in fashion lines, in department store windows, and yes, in airport corridors and regional stores where you can take home the Navajo artist R.C. Gorman's saguaro, or Robert Arnold's chili dog, and a jar of Tex-Mex picante sauce, and drink a margarita at Rosie's Cantina." She uses that word neocolonial to describe the ways in which I would say, like, I've heard this with neoliberalism as well, the ways in which progressive ideas, decolonial ideas, get co-opted and swallowed by the colonial project, so that now it's not that we can't have indigenous art in mainstream culture. It is that we actually have to sell it 10 times more and exploit it. And now that, white people or outsiders are jumping on the bandwagon, now it's going to be popular. We see this also with, like, for example, white sage and Palo Santo, where previously these practices were demonized and outlawed, and now they're becoming so mainstream that there's a shortage for the communities in which that practice was even created, right? And as she's talking about Chicana art, she starts to question that idea too. She says, Chicana artist, border artist, these adjectives label identities. Labeling affects expectations. A white poet doesn't write white in front of his name, nor is she or he referred to as white by others. A doctor is presumed to be white and male unless labeled otherwise. Is border artist just another label that strips legitimacy from the artist, signaling that she or he is inferior to the adjectiveless artist? Is border a label designating that she or he is capable of handling ethnic, folk, and regional subjects and art forms? Yet the dominant culture consumes, swallows whole the ethnic artist, sucks out his or her vitality, and then spits out the hollow husk along with its labels, such as Hispanic and more recently Latino. Though Latino preceded Hispanic, Latinos didn't become such a huge buying power until recently. The dominant culture shapes the ethnic artist's identity if she or he does not scream loud enough and fight long enough to name her or himself. Until we live in a society where all people are equal and no labels are necessary, we need them to resist the pressure to assimilate. So she's understanding the ways that these labels are both restrictive and necessary, right? She's saying that without them, those historical conditions and histories are somewhat erased in a way that is not productive. And she's recognizing that label is also doing some prejudiced work. It's also like a qualifier in a way that almost reaffirms the idea that a non-labeled artist is like almost always going to be presumably white, or as she says, a doctor, unless you qualify it. Like, if you're thinking of an artist, you're not thinking of a border artist, you're not thinking of a Chicana artist, you're thinking of maybe like, for me, I'm thinking of like a white girl with a septum piercing in a, like, I don't know, funky style. And as she recognizes the ways in which she both fully identifies with these identifying labels and also doesn't, like how they disappear other parts of her, she says, I wonder who I used to be, and I wonder who I am now. My identity keeps constantly shifting. Being Chicana or queer or writer is not enough. I am more mestiza or mixed than any particular identity. The border artist constantly reinvents her or himself. Through art, she or he is able to reread, reinterpret, re-envision, and reconstruct her or his culture's present as well as its past. She has this image here. I'll put a picture if you're looking at it, but she has this image here that is titled Identity Crisis. I think the way that people talk about it, identity crises, it is a very like internal personal struggle, whereas she says like identity crisis of individual, of community, of ethnic group, of the nation. She says identities are narrative stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And that is a quote from Stuart Hall. She says identity is performance. It is an act of projection, an artifice, a fabrication, a fiction. She says it's a defense mechanism that comes on when some aspect of us, of our identity, is criticized or attacked or threatened, and when a value or belief that is associated with that identity is challenged. So that's what she's talking about with identity crisis, and how on so many different layers it can be happening. When you're an artist that is doing work about identity crisis, those are the different levels that you're working with: individual, community, ethnic group, and nation. So she says the capacity to construct meaning and culture privileges the artist. As a cultural icon for his or her ethnic community, she or he is highly visible. But this artistic and cultural power has its drawbacks: the relentless pressure to produce, being put in the position of representing an entire pueblo and carrying all the ethnic culture's baggage on his or her back while trying to survive in a white world. Power and the seeking of greater power may create a self-centered ego or a fake public image, one the artist thinks will make her or him acceptable to an audience. It may encourage self-serving hustling, While all artists have to sell themselves to get grants, get published, secure exhibition spaces, and good reviews, for some, the hustling outdoes the art making, and we concentrate more on the career than on the writing or the art making. Some of us are invested in our image or our personality, doing ego-driven work. But for most, our art is our mission, a lifetime task of teaching tolerance and respect for the earth and the people of the earth, of making bridges. Our work is spiritual, and we try to make sure that what we put out in the world is true to our deepest convictions. So some people who are drawn to the work here are swept up in ego, right? In the image of it, in the money of it, in the, reputation of it. Whereas she says she thinks that actually most are more just focused on the actual mission. She says that the task of teaching tolerance and respect for the earth and the people of the earth. And again, she's walking through the museum, and she, of course, is thinking about death, considering that is kind of the goal of the exhibit, to showcase the quote-unquote death of the Aztec culture. But she says the specter of death always haunts the backgrounds in border art. Often las calaveras, skeletons and skulls, take a prominent position, and not just of El Dia de los Muertos. From the earth we are born, to the earth we shall return, to give back to her what she has given. Yes, I say to myself, the earth eats the dead. So she ends up it's her birthday, by the way. She's walking around this exhibit on her birthday. So she puts her birthday in this Aztec birth year calendar thing to figure out what her ritual day name is and what animal it is. As she's leaving, she starts to think about again the whole experience of going there and now leaving this thing, both finding representation in it and also finding even greater disappearance in it. But she says we are both nos, us, and otras, others, nosotras. So if you are unfamiliar with the Spanish language, nosotras is the word for we, or nosotros, depending on the gender. But she says that how we are identified is nos, us, that is the word for us, and otras, which is the word for others. And she says part of what the beauty is with art is that it makes a wider community, one that transcends the artist's culture and lifetime, right? So even Anzaldúa's work, we are talking about it today, even though she's been dead for over 20 years now. And again, towards the end of the chapter, she says, there are other borders besides the actual Mexico-U.S. frontera and other border artists occupying other Nepantlas. So her framework is rooted in her experience, right? That's really all we can ask about anyone. But what she's doing is inviting other people inhabiting other Nepantlas, other borderlands, to use this sort of framework, use this understanding. Part of what I want to reiterate too is that the borderlands, as written about in her book titled Borderlands, is not just about the physical borders that we move through and that have impacted our personal histories. It's also just the psychological borders that come into fruition naturally out of that situation. I'm also thinking about, recently I saw some white spiritual person on TikTok saying that they felt like they didn't have a right to ancestral work, because I think that a lot of white people are unaware of their own pagan roots and unaware of even how the term white has been used against, for example, the Irish, right? The Italians. And so I always encourage people to learn their own histories and sort of apply this Borderlands work, even if it's just the mental borderlands of the psyche. But part of what I think is a problem currently, and for people who consider themselves to be spiritual, is this lack of really reckoning with what the word whiteness even means, what it means to be white, how the category of whiteness was constructed. I think that has to be at the root of your own spiritual journey, because your spiritual journey is wrapped up in your family's history, which is wrapped up in the nation's history or global history, depending on your family. And all of that is deeply connected to your present. So I find it fitting that, I pulled for today the Two of Swords and the Six of Pentacles, because the Two of Swords is all about being at a crossroads, being, pulled in different directions. And the Six of Pentacles is about generosity, but it's also about inheritance. It is what we inherit. It is generational, both for better or for worse. I think too much of people's understanding of even themselves is very much rooted in ego and the way that we think about like healing is a very individual journey. But in reality, this is generational. Inherently, it's generational. Healing is generational. It's communal. And so again, this chapter it's relatively shorter than some of the others, but it's got a lot going on because it's both this like deep connection to Chicana culture and the Chicana label itself, and also recognizing that it is not all encompassing. It is not fully encapsulating of who she is or her history. And it is limiting, right? To think about calling an artist a border artist or a Chicana artist. She's recognizing both the importance and the tension of it. And that is part of what Nepantla is. It like part of what people do is they avoid, challenging things because if it doesn't land neatly on either side, it's almost seen as like a loss. But Anzaldúa is recognizing the nuance to it all, the complexity of it all, where she can acknowledge two things can be true at once. And that itself is a Nepantla way of thinking. And I will also connect that to the mestiza consciousness that she talks about in Borderlands, that double awareness. Even when you move through your daily life, like the personal decisions are both deeply affected by and influential of generational decisions and contexts. And so I encourage all of us like to just sit with that, with what Anzaldúa is really asking us, where, like for me, for example, I connect very deeply to the identity of being a lesbian. And also lately it's felt super restrictive and like the different labels of what kind of lesbian you are, right? Like I think when I was younger, I really tried to find solace in that. I wanted to fit a label to help me understand myself better. And as I get older, I learn more and more that that's just not really how I understand myself. And that, to be honest, I don't really think that's how anyone comes to understand themselves unless you mold yourself to that label, right? So get curious about those labels, get curious about your histories, right? I think too many people associate whiteness, first of all, as if the category of whiteness itself is neutral or natural, but also that whiteness is inherently divorced from ancestral work or working with the land, right? Like look into druidry, look into different, even like occult practices, I would say. I think that tarot is deeply connected to storytelling and different ways of thinking, right? Different ways of knowing. And that's what this whole book is about. So I hope that that's given you a lot to think about up until next week, and I'll see you next time.